All right, ready to dive into something interesting.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Today we're tackling The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck
Okay.
by Mark Manson.
Yeah.
And, the title might throw some people off,
Right.
but it's not about just being indifferent, right?
No, not at all.
It's about figuring out what actually matters.
It's about priorities.
Right.
It is. It's like he's addressing that feeling of just being overwhelmed, by all the negative stuff. He calls it the feedback loop from hell. And I think we've all been there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like
Yeah.
that moment when everything's going wrong and it just spirals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He gives the example of being anxious about a presentation.
Right.
And then you start getting anxious about being anxious.
Oh, it's the worst.
It's like it feeds itself.
Totally.
So how do we escape that loop, right? Well, he doesn't actually say just stop caring.
Oh, okay. So what does he say?
He talks about this idea of being really strategic with your energy. We all have a limited amount. He calls it choosing your fucks.
Choosing your fucks. I like that.
It's about deciding what's actually worth your time and energy.
That reminds me of that example he uses, the kid throwing a fit over the, exact shade of blue of a hat or something.
Yes, it's a perfect example of how we waste energy on things that ultimately don't matter.
Right. It's so easy to get caught up in those little things.
It really is. So instead of sweating the small stuff, Manson's saying, save it. Save your energy for the things that matter, your relationships, the stuff you're passionate about.
It's like choosing who you spend your time with.
Exactly.
You want to be around people who energize you, not drain you.
100%.
Yeah.
And this all ties into another big idea he has. Happiness, he says. It doesn't come from having no problem.
Oh, interesting.
It comes from solving problems.
Yeah.
Problems that actually mean something to you.
So you're not avoiding challenges, you're choosing the ones that are worth tackling.
Exactly. Like say you finally join that gym, right? You've been meaning to.
Okay, yeah.
That solves one problem, but it also creates new ones. Now you have to figure out how to fit workouts into your schedule.
Yes, find the motivation.
Exactly. But those are good problems, right?
They push you to grow.
Right. And that sense of accomplishment, even if it's small, that's what builds happiness. And then he gets into this other idea that can be a little hard to hear at first. You're not special.
Oh, boy. Yeah, that one can sting a bit.
It's not that you can't do great things.
Yeah.
But it's more about, checking that sense of entitlement.
Oh, I see. It's that the world revolves around me attitude.
Yes, exactly.
And honestly, nobody likes that.
And to make this point, he tells this great story about this guy, Jimmy.
What's Jimmy's deal?
Jimmy's always got these big ideas for businesses, but none of them ever quite get going. But here's the thing. Jimmy's not actually upset that his businesses are failing. He's upset because he thinks he's entitled to success without putting in the work. He likes the idea of being a successful entrepreneur way more than he likes the actual work of being an entrepreneur.
It's like he's focused on the destination, but not the journey.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky.
Yeah.
Because we're constantly bombarded with these images of success, especially on social media.
Oh, it's the highlight reel, right? Not the behind the scenes.
And that's what he calls the tyranny of exceptionalism.
No?
It makes us feel like we're not good enough, but it's all a facade.
Yeah.
So he suggests, what if we just accept that we're all kind of average?
It takes the pressure off, right? You don't have to be perfect all the time.
Exactly. It allows you to focus on your own growth, your own pace, instead of constantly comparing yourself to everyone else.
And that's a recipe for misery, comparing yourself to others.
100%. Because we all have our own journey, our own struggles.
Exactly.
And honestly, comparison just steals your joy.
So if we're not special and everyone's on their own path, how do we even begin to figure out what truly matters? How do we define success on our own terms?
That's where he brings in this idea of values.
Okay. Values?
Values are they're your guiding principles,
Yeah.
They're what you stand for, even when things get tough.
So instead of chasing some external definition of success, it's about building a life that actually reflects those values.
Exactly. And he talks about how certain values like honesty, being vulnerable, being curious about the world,
Yeah.
those tend to lead to more fulfilling lives
Right.
compared to things like always needing attention or measuring your worth by how much stuff you have.
It's like that saying, you can have it all, but you have to be willing to sacrifice everything to get it.
Ooh, that's a good word.
It makes you think twice, right?
Yeah.
What are you willing to give up? And is it worth it?
Right. And he uses these two really interesting examples to illustrate this. Pete Best, the drummer who got kicked out of the Beatles right before they made it big,
Oh, wow.
and Dave Mustaine, the guitarist who was kicked out of Metallica and went on to form Megadeth.
Okay, so both of them, you could say, experienced a huge setback. I mean, they were in bands that achieved incredible success.
Right. And it was the same kind of setback, in a way.
Right.
But their reactions, their values, took them down completely different paths.
So how did their values shape their experiences?
Well, Best, he seemed to find happiness and fulfillment in family, in having a normal life. Mustaine, on the other hand, even though he became successful with Megadeth,
Right.
he still constantly measured himself against Metallica's success. It really shows how your values color your perception of success and failure.
So it's not just about what happens to you, it's how you choose to see it.
Exactly. And that's empowering, right? You get to choose what you value, what you measure yourself against.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're talking about values, but life isn't always easy, right? How do we deal with those curveballs?
That's where he makes this really important distinction between fault and responsibility.
Okay, I've heard him talk about that. How does he differentiate those?
So you might not always be at fault for the situation you're in.
Like if your flight gets canceled, it's not your fault.
Exactly. But you're always responsible for how you respond.
Right. You can choose to be miserable about it or
Or you can find a way to make the most of it.
Eh.
Maybe even have an adventure because of it.
it's about focusing on what you can control,
Yes.
and that takes practice. Speaking of control, he also talks about the power of saying no,
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
setting boundaries.
It is. It's about saying no to the things that drain you, the relationships that no longer serve you,
Yeah.
anything that doesn't align with those values we were talking about.
He tells that really funny story about his time in Russia.
Oh, yeah. What about it?
He was struck by how straightforward people were.
Oh, right, right. Like, if something was dumb, they just said it was dumb.
Exactly. No sugarcoating.
So how did that shape his views on saying no?
It made him realize that honesty, even if it's a little uncomfortable sometimes, is so important. And that saying no is essential for protecting your time and energy.
It's like if you're constantly saying yes to things you don't want to do, you end up feeling resentful and exhausted.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're choosing our battles, we're taking responsibility, we're living by our values. But then there are those bigger questions, right? The things that really make you stop and think.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, what are you thinking about?
Well, he doesn't shy away from the big stuff, like death.
Yeah.
That's a heavy one. But it makes you think, right? Like all the things we do, the goals, the stuff we accumulate.
Right. It makes you wonder.
Are we just trying to outrun our own mortality?
That's a great question. It's
Yeah.
like, are we trying to create something that will outlive us?
It's a lot to process.
He talks about this book, The Denial of Death,
Okay.
by Ernest Becker.
Mhm.
And the idea that we create these immortality projects, religion, art, politics, even just chasing wealth or status
Wow.
as a way to leave our mark on the world.
Because on some level, we're all afraid of being forgotten.
It's a pretty deep fear. So how do we deal with that? With that fear of death, that desire for significance? It's a great question. Well, he suggests that by actually confronting that fear, by accepting that we are mortal, we can actually find a lot of freedom.
Freedom.
Yeah. It's like, imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down. It's scary.
Terrifying.
But there's also this weird exhilaration.
Because it puts things in perspective.
Exactly. It makes you realize what's really important. And that's where this idea of not giving a fuck comes full circle. It's not about apathy. It's about letting go of that fear, the fear of death, the need to be remembered.
Like it's not about building some legacy.
Right. It's about realizing that your life doesn't need some grand, predefined purpose. It can just be about, living.
Please, living for today.
Exactly. It's about the people you love, the things you're passionate about. Those are the things that give your life meaning.
And that's different for everyone.
Of course. There's no one right answer.
Yeah.
And he actually shares a really powerful story about his friend, Josh, who passed away.
I remember that part. It was really sad.
It was. And for Manson, it was this wake-up call. It made him realize how fragile life is. He quit smoking, started taking his studies more seriously.
It really turned his life around.
He did. And it all came from this realization that our time is limited. So what are we going to do with it?
It's about asking yourself, what would I regret not doing?
Exactly. And then having the guts to actually go do those things. Because life's too short to be stuck in regret. It's about embracing the present moment.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It really is. This whole conversation has been so thought-provoking.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, is there one thing you hope our listeners take away from Manson's book?
If I had to pick just one, it's that you get to choose. Your life is yours to create. Choose your values. Choose your challenges. Choose how you respond when things get tough. Don't be afraid to be imperfect. And remember, we're all going to die someday, so don't waste your time on things that don't matter. Live a life that's true to you.
That's a great place to end it. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about. What are you choosing to give a fuck about? Is it worth your time and energy? And most importantly, are you living a life that you love? Because ultimately, that's what matters.